Welcome back to the third episode of my brisket trimming series, where I trim brisket like the pros in hopes that their tips and tricks will be adopted into my technique. On today's episode, I'll be trimming brisket like Jeremy Yoder from Mad Scientist BBQ. So I'm super excited to do this video because Mad Scientist BBQ was one of the first barbecue YouTube channels that I started watching. And I was inspired to try cooking myself, and I absolutely fell in love with the hobby. So I am a big fan of the Mad Scientist BBQ channel. I just love the way that Jeremy explains the science behind why he does certain things and goes really into depth. And on top of that, his barbecue B-roll game is probably the best in the barbecue YouTube community. From my knowledge, the Mad Scientist BBQ channel doesn't have a specific video where he details how he trims brisket. So because of this, I'm gonna be using information from two separate videos from the Mad Scientist BBQ channel. So the videos are called How to Smoke Brisket plus Smoked Beef Tallow, Mad Scientist BBQ, and the other video is called How to Smoke Brisket. And I'll have both of those videos linked in the description below. So enough talk, and let's do this thing. Okay, so I picked up a beautiful prime brisket that's 14.5 pounds from Costco. So Mad Scientist BBQ's first tip is to put the brisket in the freezer for about an hour before you're gonna cut, because it's easier and safer to trim the fat when it's cold rather than when it's like melting inside of your hand. So unlike Jerby and Chud's barbecue, Mad Scientist actually starts trimming his brisket on the fat side first. The first thing I'm gonna tackle is the Mohawk, which is this big hunk of meat on the fat side of the brisket. So there is some conflicting information about the Mohawk in both of Jeremy's videos, which does make sense because they're about 3 years apart from each other. But basically in his older video, he completely cuts off the Mohawk. But in the new one, it seems like he keeps the Mohawk, but he just kind of carves out the fat from the inside of the Mohawk. So I assume that Jeremy has learned a lot over the last 3 years about barbecue. So I'm gonna go ahead and follow the latter video, and I'm just going to keep the Mohawk and I'm going to just carve out the fat. So the next step is the fat directly under the Mohawk. This is basically where the point and the flat muscles meet together. So Jeremy does a complete 90-degree cut from where the fat start and just completely takes out the whole glob of fat. And he doesn't seem too worried about scalping the meat here, so I'm not gonna lose sleep over it either. So on both of his videos, he's not super specific on how to trim the fat off of the rest of the fat side of the brisket, but he basically says to trim it to about 1/4 of an inch. Okay, so now on to the lean side of the brisket. So Jeremy actually shaves down the Deckle Fat instead of carving it out. And I think he does this so that the fat will protect the burnt ends on the other side of the brisket. And next he takes off the silver skin off of the top of the brisket. And finally, he cuts off the lean part of the flat that's not more than 1/2 inch thick and rounds that out so the edges don't burn. And his last step is a super cool trick for barbecue rookies like myself. So he makes a cut at the bottom of the brisket to remind himself how to cut the brisket once it's done cooking. So I had this exact problem when I tried to cut brisket like Jerby in the first episode, and this trick would have really came in handy. And that's all there is for the trim. So I'm gonna go ahead and salt this thing and then season it with some Big Bad Beef Rub by Meathead Goldwyn, and then stick it in the fridge until it's time to put it on the pellet grill. So on the 2 previous videos in this series, I put the brisket on the pellet grill at night, went to sleep, woke up about 8 hours later, and then sprayed it and wrapped it. But when doing that on my last cook, because I kept the Mohawk on the brisket, it made the burnt ends a little too burnt for my taste. So I've already put the brisket on the pellet grill, and I'm really gonna try and just spray and baby those burnt ends so I don't have the same problem this time around. Brisket should be ready to wrap around nighttime when I'm gonna go to sleep, and then should be ready in the morning. Bye. So as always, before we cut this thing open, I need to give a big thank you and shout out to Jeremy Yoder from Mad Scientist Barbecue. Thank you for sharing your expertise in your videos and your techniques. And I'll have a link to his channel on the screen, so make sure to check that out. Okay, one last thing before I cut this, I need to make a confession. So basically, I wrapped this thing last night, went to sleep, and the hope was to wake up and it would be ready to go. When I woke up in the morning around 5 o'clock, I saw that the Traeger app was telling me that the brisket was temping at 2:15 at 3 in the morning. So this thing is ultra tender. As such, I expect the flat to be dry and the point to be a little bit overly tender, but that's on me, that's not on Jeremy's technique at all. I overslept, my bad. Okay, so right off the bat, I'm very thankful for this cut because I know exactly where to cut the brisket. Oh, still pretty juicy. As I was saying earlier, a little bit dry, but it is very tender. So despite the brisket being overcooked, I think it turned out fantastic. Some things that I noticed about the cut, there were certain parts of the flat that had a little bit too much fat on it, especially near the end where the point and the flat muscles meet. But I think that comes from, instead of removing all of the Deckle fat on the Mohawk, kind of like caving it out instead. I kind of like Chud's version better, where you kind of just take all of it out, but I was just trying my best to emulate the way that Jeremy was showing on his video. It was literally like a 10-second clip where it showed the aftermath of what the brisket looked like, and you know, maybe that's on me, I didn't copy him well enough, but other than that, I thought everything else looked great. Even the point, it only had this one chunk of fat, and on the Mohawk side, I didn't have to trim any fat off, and it was all just that big hunk of beautiful burnt end. So I'm gonna go ahead and try this thing. All right, you guys get the first bite. First bite gang. Quick time, guys. Nice. Oh my gosh, that is so good. It's weird, okay? Like, in terms of flavor, that tasted better than any of the other briskets I cooked, but it reminds me of my original Traeger brisket video that I did, where it was like so overly tender, but like it had such good flavor to it. So if you enjoyed the content, make sure to subscribe and click the next video on your screen, and I will see you guys on the next one. Later.